Milling Through History presents Cooking for Freedom, the life of Hercules Posey. When we look at the life of Hercules Posey, he is perhaps one of the most interesting men who had been around George Washington during some of the most formative years of our nation's history. And yet, for all the information we know about this time period, it is perhaps this one life which, while we have very little knowledge, we can certainly place it into the whole spectrum of events and begin to paint a portrait of what it could be and what it should have been. Hercules Posey was born, it is believed, around the year 1748 and was most likely owned first by John Posey. In 1771, George Washington would acquire Hercules as collateral for a debt that was unpaid by Posey to Washington. In fact, by the time of 1770, the Posey family had been living at Mount Vernon for a number of years and was now being forced to leave. Now, when Hercules became the property of Washington, he would choose Alice, one of Mrs. Washington's enslaved peoples, to be his wife, and together they would have 3 children, Richmond, Eve, and Delia. What he did during the American Revolution is uncertain, but between 1771 and 1790, we do know that Hercules became an accomplished cook and would become one of 9 slaves brought to Pennsylvania to work in the presidential home. Now, prior to the arrival of the Washingtons to Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania legislature had passed a law into effect which would bring about gradual manumission to those who were enslaved. One of the provisos within the bill included a part that said any slave who resided in Pennsylvania for more than 6 months would then be allowed to become free, as the state of Pennsylvania would recognize these enslaved individuals as residents of the state, and therefore eligible for manumission. Now, privately, George Washington challenged the law, but in consultation with his attorney general, opted not to publicly go against it. Instead, he would rotate his enslaved peoples in and out of Philadelphia every 6 months between Mount Vernon and the then temporary nation's capital. Now, while living in Philadelphia, Hercules was celebrated as an artiste and was highly accomplished in the culinary arts as anyone else could have possibly have been in the United States at the time. He was even given the privilege of being able to sell extra food from the presidential kitchen, which would usually earn him annually about $200. This sum is rather important to note because Hercules was effectively making as much money as a hired cook was in Philadelphia at the same time. Now, according to records, Hercules was also a bit of a known personality within the city, as he was known for being a dapper dresser and wearing a red turban on his head. In November of 1796, Richmond, Hercules' son, was implicated in the theft of some money at Mount Vernon, and George Washington would suspect that both father and son were conspiring together in a plot to run away. Now, when Hercules learned about this, he was rather surprised that Washington could not trust him, and feeling that if Washington believed he was going to run away, might as well do so. And as such, Hercules would run away on February the 22nd, 1797, while everyone was celebrating his birthday. Records from Mount Vernon show that Hercules had at least a 4-day head start on his run for freedom. Now, Hercules would remain a fugitive slave until January the 1st, 1801, when Mrs. Washington would free all of George Washington's slaves per his instructions in his will. Now, originally, the instructions in the will said upon her death, but she moved that up. Nobody knows if Hercules ever learned about his being freed. However, sources do indicate that Hercules made his way from Mount Vernon first to Philadelphia and then to New York City. By 1801, any records about Hercules ceased to exist, as most people believed he had died. However, one source does indicate that Hercules Posey died in 1812 after suffering from consumption, and was then buried in the Second African Burying Ground. And while his story tragically comes to an end like this, there is rather unique speculation. For a long period of time, there was a portrait claiming to be that of Hercules hanging in the Royal Gallery in Spain. And so, while it is not necessarily a very good idea to change the narrative of a story in order to make it seem better, for this historian, knowing how Hercules actually spent the last years of his life, it seems rather sad to think that in running away to freedom, he ends up dying and effectively placed into a pauper's grave. Rather, I like to think of this particular ending for him, that he found his way into the courts of Europe, cooking for royalty, and upon his passing, even the kings and queens of Europe had to acknowledge the loss of a great skilled artisan.